Welcome to Current Affairs. My name is Nathan Robinson. I am the editor-in-chief of Current Affairs magazine. Returning to the program today, my guest is Adolph Reed, Professor Emeritus of Political Science at the University of Pennsylvania, the co-host of the Class Matters podcast put out through the Debs Jones Douglas Institute, available at classmatterspodcast.org, and the author of the book The South, Jim Crow and Its Afterlives, available from Verso. Adolph Reed, thank you so much for joining us on Current Affairs.
Oh, hey, Nathan, thanks for having me. It's always my pleasure, and thanks for the plug for the podcast.
Hey, great to talk to you again. This book, when this book came out, and I didn't know this book was going to come out, Verso sent us a copy. I found it, some of our listeners may be familiar with your previous work. I was surprised by it. I was surprised by it for a few reasons, because I've never seen you write things that are so personal. I've never seen you burn with the fire of indignation at white supremacy the way that you do in this book. And the other thing about this book that was a little surprising is it has a certain kind of optimism. You're not necessarily known for your positivity, but there's a kind of positive message that comes out of this. So this book, to people who know you by your reputation as, what do they call you, a class reductionist? This book will surprise people, I think.
Well, it should. Yeah. I mean, it's interesting that because, the genesis of the book, but when the children who handled catalog copy for Verso sent me a first draft, I freaked out, man. I sent like a flame mail, as they used to be called, like to everybody I knew at the press, because they were billing it as a combination memoir and Bildungsroman. And I've been saying from the very beginning that this book is not a memoir. And for people who've read it, I mean, they'll know that the story is that it emerges from conversations that I've been having with 2 or 3 really close friends at the end of the last century around the idea that when our rough age cohort leaves the stage of history, there won't be anyone around any longer who has any direct living connection to the Jim Crow era. And I just started writing something, and I wrote myself into a 15 to 20,000 page, no man's land, right, in the early 2000s. And the book sat on my computer for a long time. And I built it around what the idea was to try to give a thick account of the complexities of the social order, especially focused below the level of laws and official regulation, to get some sense of how people actually lived under it and the impact that it had on everybody. And the hook was to anchor it to a number of vignettes that took off from incidents in my life, right? Mm. I tried intermittently for some years to get it published, but even friends at Met Magazine said, well, it's too long for an article, and I knew it was too short for a book. So finally, between the historian Barbara Fields, who read it and insisted I get it published, and my former agent, Faith Childs, who read it, insisted I get it published, and also gave me, and this is most important, gave me like a dozen or so specific things to do, which I did. I mean, everybody wanted there to be more of my life in it. Yeah. And what you see is a compromise, right? Because I prefer for there not to be any, but I hope I did it in a way that's kind of useful, and it makes clear that it's not a memoir. But often enough, when I do talks on the book, I'll begin by saying, first of all, this is not a memoir. And I guess just to underscore that point, Faith tried to shop it around to several trade presses, even what wasn't Nation Books. I forget what they call it now. And the response that she got was, I don't know what kind of book this is.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Right, because people want some version of the Up From Slavery story, right?
Right.
And the young woman at the Nation even said that when she saw that Faith had a project from me, she got excited, but then when she read the prospectus, she couldn't make heads or tails of it, right? So, I mean, thank God for Verso, and especially like for Asher Doopy Spencer, whose family is half from down here, and his mother still lives across the river, so he has more sensitivity to it all. But yeah, I mean, that's what I wanted to do, and that's where the book came from. I've seen some people express surprise. A couple even complain that I don't engage in like the theoretical debates, and I don't name names of some of the pathologies that I identify or I refer to. But the point is, it's not a book for those debates, right? It's a book for a more general audience, right? For people who first of all, don't operate at 30,000 feet in the air. I mean, who are interested in concrete examination and, even kind of a reflection on that period in history and its complexities and how it differed from one place to another and evolved over time and so forth and so on.
Yeah, because while I know you are a person who would never write a memoir,
Thank you very much.
it is also the case that you happen to be a person who has a lot of first-person experiences, as you show us in the book, a social order that vanished, that is now
Right.
mostly gone, although that has sort of these lingering echoes. And you are able to tell us in this book and clear up some misconceptions and deepen our understanding of what the Jim Crow system in the 50s and 60s was actually like for those who had to live under it day to day, because you lived in New Orleans at the time, sort of on and off. You had an interesting kind of like insider outsider perspective, and that you weren't completely New Orleanian.
Right.
So one of the primary things you do in this book is to get us beyond, as you say, the familiar imagery of water fountains, lunch counters, and restrooms, and show us what it was like for people to live in this system.
Well, yeah, I got to say, man, I'm pleased to hear that you seem to think I did it somewhat effectively. So that's great because that's the point. And I'll tell you, I mean, to be honest, and I mean, my son actually has been urging me to do more of this. But one of the reasons that I find it so ironic and also increasingly get kind of steamed within is when lefties come at me and say, well, you don't understand racism. And to be completely honest, I get especially steamed when white lefties come at me right in that way. And I mean, I will hasten to point out that it's within the framework of their ideology that I think they don't have a right to do that, right? I mean, not mine.
Right.
Right. I just saw one of those a couple of days ago, whom I won't name. So, despite my Catholic upbringing, right, I'm enough of a child of the Enlightenment, right, to understand that the quality of an argument doesn't really depend on the position of or the personal authority of the utterer, right? So, and so I feel that I don't need to try to trot my bona fides out to, justify my arguments. And plus, look, it's not like I'm Gandhi saying, well, but look, I'm a great leader, so like you can't say anything about me. I was a foot soldier in those movements and also lived as a child, a teen, and a young adult, right, in the Jim Crow orders.
Right.
Well, I guess what I'm trying to say is that authenticity is always a bullshit argument. I hope I can say bullshit. Or claims to authenticity are, and I don't want to depend on them. And I'm not that guy, basically.
Sure. But that being said, I do think that the people who, for example, I guess they got your event canceled at the DSA because they said, you don't care about...
They got me to cancel it. That's what happened.
Oh, they got you to cancel. They pressured you to not speak to the DSA.
Yeah, this is water way under a little tiny bridge now. But to be clear, so I and my friend and colleague Merlin Chalkwanian were going to lead a discussion right around the problems with racial disparity discourse about COVID. And a few days before, a group that called itself the Afro-Socialist and BIPOC Caucus of the New York DSA protested and actually took down the ads from their social media pages. And then the morning of the event, just a few hours before, issued a demand that the event be canceled and reformulated as a debate between what they described as my class reductionist views and their whatever they were, multiracial socialist views, whatever. So Merlin and I talked about it, and then we talked to our hosts who wanted to go ahead with it, right? But they honored our concerns. And this was early enough in the Zoom world that we knew about Zoom bombing and all that stuff, and I had no idea how it could be controlled. And we just decided, look, it's not worth the effort. This is DSA anyway. It's not like it's something that really matters.
Well, the point is, though, that I feel like the people who made those arguments against you, I feel as if any of them actually sat down to read The South, Jim Crow and Its Afterlives,
Yeah.
you could say the authenticity argument is bullshit, but I do feel as if it becomes much more uncomfortable to try and make those arguments against you having read it.
Well, I think that's partly because you were also a child of the Enlightenment, and just imagine that people pay attention to arguments.
Sure.
But I'll tell you what, though, like the funniest moment, and in a way, one of the most ironic and for that reason kind of infuriating. I wrote a series of essays here and there, The Nation and Progressive, in aftermath of Hurricane Katrina. And, all my family down here was displaced, right? And, I'm not saying that to pull rank about anything either. But both Manning Marable, the late Manning Marable, and David Roediger came at me or responded to my arguments by saying that I don't understand the depth of racism in the city of New Orleans, even. And I thought, well, that's like hubris, right? It's like morons hubris, but it's hubris.
Perhaps you could tell us a little bit about, I mean, you go through in the book the many, many different ways in which the system operated, but perhaps you could give us a couple of glimpses of what it was actually like in the New Orleans of your childhood and young adulthood and how it differed from today.
Oh, well, yeah, I can give it a shot. So, one of the incidents that I mentioned in the book that seems to have affected a lot of people was, when I was living in New York and my little cousin was in Jersey, we would come down here for the summers and spend a chunk of the summer with our grandparents. And when we were 5, we're basically the same age. We went to the Audubon Zoo and saw ponies and got excited. This is when I was in my Roy Rogers moment. And we wanted to ride the ponies. And the guy who ran the pony ride told us we couldn't ride because it's whites only. And neither one of us, of course, knew anything about that or understood about what it meant. My grandmother dressed him down. But as I said in the book, and like this is not obviously a perspective that was available to me at 5 or frankly at 15 or maybe not even at 25. But in retrospect, it was easy to say this guy was a racist. He could just as easily have been both a racist or not a racist at all, but somebody who didn't want to lose a job. And his job depended partly on him maintaining segregation, in this pony ride, right?
Mm-hmm.
And there was a lot of that, right, that went on. And the thing that people forget, and this is one of the points I try to hammer on, is that the Jim Crow regime wasn't just imposed on Black people, it was imposed on everybody. It was imposed on white people, right? And that's one of the reasons that I talk about the quotidian neighborhood life in my own neighborhood, right? Because it was a mixed one. I mean, people here will know, presumably, that in the older neighborhoods in the city, residential segregation was not a thing. Well, I mean, not that people were egalitarians, right? I mean, hardly, but that the neighborhood hadn't been invented yet as a space to be defined by class and racial exclusivity, right?
Mm-hmm.
So what that meant was, until I was well into high school, in our neighborhood, often whites lived at one end of the block and blacks on the other, whites on one side of the street, blacks on the other, whites between blacks, blacks between whites, whatever. And what existed there was recognition or sort of natural emergence of patterns of cross-racial quotidian interaction on a plane of something like equal citizenship, right? Or at least equal citizenship within the neighborhood. Now that would break down when it left the neighborhood. It was enacted within constraints of the larger racial etiquette so that there was no popping over for a cup of coffee right to one another's houses, but conversations across backyard fences or passing a time of day, chatting up what's going on in the neighborhood, on a basis of immediate equality, right? And I take that kind of to underscore that the fact that strict racial separation on the apartheid model wasn't the normal evolution or character of post-emancipation urban Black life, right? It varied depending on where you were, certainly. but that it was imposed, right? That regime was imposed by, the ruling class. There I go again. After the defeat of populism, which had posed a legitimate cross-racial, interracial threat, to ruling class power in most of the region. And like even here in that context, 1892, there was a general strike that included black and white workers. At the same time that the walls of segregation had begun to descend, local authorities, except the mayor, who was pro-labor, but the governor, Murphy J. Foster, who was Governor Mike Foster's grandfather and was originally a planter from one of those Saints parishes, cane planter, sent in a militia. Local authorities and the local media race baited the strikers, and the strike held, right? The strikers were successful. When the state imposed a separate car ordinance, like for streetcars, whites and blacks objected to it. And again, not necessarily because whites or blacks were deeply committed to ideals of racial equality. It just seemed like an unnecessary interference, which kind of amounts to the same thing when you think about it, right? Or when you bring the high principles down to earth, because what that said was that whites didn't care enough about being separated from blacks in that setting to put up with the hassle of having to deal with it, right? So I think there was a lot of that, right? I mean, but it was also the case that, since race wasn't real anyway, trying to impose a system of strict racial segregation was very difficult, right? Because you have all these areas of quotidian life where the rules didn't make any sense and it couldn't be applied. But I mean, I watched that doofus movie, The Help, a few years ago, and one thing that struck me was that the character who was the active racial segregationist was, first of all, played as a buffoon, right? So no one could be sympathetic to her, but her cause was to get the state legislature to require whites who had maids, basically, to build separate bathrooms on their houses for the maids to use. And of course, one winning argument against that one was what was in effect, which, first of all, no one ever proposed anywhere. But within the context of the film, one of the successful arguments against it was a neoliberal one, right? It's too expensive, right? But also, and like this is a problem with enforcement of the regime here in New Orleans in particular, it was very difficult to figure out who was supposed to be on which side of the racial divide, right? I mean, but the city was already like the largest or the second largest city in Honduras and Belize. Cubans began to trickle in, right? To all those, I mean, Sicilians, right, who were indistinguishable from the black Creole population, the Isleños.
Yeah.
And plus, we not forget, as Earl K. Long said in the 1960 governor's race, when asked what he intended to do to appeal to the white population in South Louisiana, Long said, well, look, you can feed all the really white people in South Louisiana off one plate of red beans and rice. So like, nobody could really stand the pressure.
Yeah. So, I mean, you sort of emphasize in the book that the regime was absurd, that it was incredibly complicated.
Right.
There were all these kinds of rules that, as you say, didn't make any sense, couldn't really be enforced, and that everyone just had to suffer all of these inconveniences and hassles, which I suppose partially explains why the thing was so fragile. If there were so few kind of true believers, if it was imposed by a ruling class and most people, even white people, were going along because the rules were the rules rather than because the rules made any sense.
Right. Well, yeah, I mean, the qualifier that I'd add is once the rules have been in place for a little while, then they're normal, right? So people may not even feel the inconvenience or like may not have felt the inconvenience. But I also, I discussed a couple of incidents, I think, in which what I wound up having more than decent encounters with white people that just assumed common humanity. But at the same time, like one of them was on the edge or the verge of the school desegregation crisis in 1960. One was even earlier. And I said in the book, like, I have no naivete about how those people would have responded or did respond to the explicitly racial crises or the sit-ins or whatever, right? Because there's a way that race, is kind of an identity that's commanded, and especially in the context of moments of intense mobilization, right? Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, here's another illustration. It's from a different context entirely. But Johnson and Rourke's book, Black Masters, on a slave-owning Black South Carolina family, notes, among other things, that especially in Charleston, well, I mean, there was a free Black population who worked as artisans. There was an enslaved Black population who were skilled craftsmen who were permitted to rent out their own labor. Of course, the owner gets a cut right on the local open market. And there's evidence that the white planter class, actually preferred the mid-skill level white artisans with whom the slaves competed, right, for labor, until the 1850s. And two things happened in the 1850s. One is that the pace of immigration to Charleston from Europe increased. But the other, that's maybe even more important, is that by the 1850s, the governing class, like in Charleston, was already beginning to get a sense that at some point secession may become an issue. And from that perspective, they became all the more likely to define these white artisans or the white working class as white, and to appeal to them on the basis of a shared white identity, which at the time, it was in one way or another being crafted or accentuated. And that's kind of what the point of the Jim Crow order was. I'll tell you, we did an organizing campaign in South Carolina in 05 and 06 to win a ballot line for a Labor Party there, which we did. And one of the places that we worked to get the signatures that we needed to get to present to the Secretary of State was at flea markets. And flea markets in South Carolina, as I guess they are a lot of places, were like working class malls or malls for the working class. And as soon as we got down there and started working, I thought, God, I can see why Ben Tillman and the other segregationists were so intent separating the races at the end of the 19th century, because of the high frequency of interracial couples, blended families, right? The white grandmother who looks like she just stepped out of Let Us Now Praise Famous Men, but holding her little black or part black grandbaby. All this stuff is much more complex. And that complexity is partly what fueled the populist insurgency at the end of the 19th century. So once these guys got power, first move was to disfranchise almost all of the Black population and as much of the white population as it could get away with. And the next move was to impose the apartheid regime.
Why was the Jim Crow regime so fragile? You write at one point that in 1950, almost no one, no matter how far left or how optimistic, would have predicted that the back of the system would have been broken within 15 years. And obviously that's why that line is one of the reasons why I say this is in part an optimistic book, because it suggests that things that seem fixed and immutable are actually able to be destroyed rather quickly.
Right.
But why was it so vulnerable?
Well, see, this is one of the beautiful things to me from an historian's perspective, right? The embodiment of the dictum that the world moves by contradiction. Okay. So what happened was, first of all, the order was the regime of a particular class, planter, merchant, capitalist class, right? The plantation economy becomes less and less vital, right, over the course of the first half of the 20th century. But then also unexpecteds happen, like World War I chokes off access to immigration from Southern and Eastern Europe as sources of low-wage factory labor, right, to fuel burgeoning industry like in the North and Midwest. And in the absence of that steady supply, labor recruiters begin to look south to recruit Blacks from the South. That's how we get the Great Migration. And one of the dumber debates that historians have ever engaged is whether the Great Migration was a result of push factors like fleeing racial brutality or pull factors like opportunity and decent wage. The two sides of the same coin. You can't separate them really. But that's what happened. Well, as the black population grows outside the South, it's once again a voting population. And with the coming of FDR and the New Deal, the black vote becomes more and more important in the National Democratic Coalition, which helps, along with other factors, right? But it helps to encourage the New Deal wing of the Democratic Party to support black rights and aspirations. You're a lawyer, so this won't be news. But in 1935, in a Supreme Court case called Grovey v. Townsend, the Supreme Court upheld the Democratic white primary. The white primary was one of the mechanisms that Southern elites put in place after the defeat of Reconstruction to disfranchise. That was part of an ensemble of techniques of disfranchisement. And what the white primary was it defined the Democratic Party as a private club, which could set its own membership, and only members could vote in the primary. So if it's a white club, then only whites could vote in the Democratic primary. And after crushing of the Republican and populist opposition, the Democratic primary was basically the general election. So in 1935, in Grovey v. Townsend, the Supreme Court upheld the white primary. 9 years later, in Smith v. Allred, 1944, the same Supreme Court, membership had changed some, but the same Supreme Court found it was unconstitutional. Well, what accounts for the difference is partly institutional, right? Like FDR had been able to make more appointments to the court. The federal judiciary had changed so much, but also like the center of gravity in national politics about race had moved in an egalitarian direction. Well, the planners weren't prepared for that, right? And part of that movement had been a result of blacks both, doing sort of mass movement politics and mass mobilization as Democratic voters that altered the balance of forces in national politics. What I didn't realize at the time, because I was young, was that what I was living through, or would be, right? Because you couldn't foretell any of this, the death paroxysms of the Jim Crow order. So I hope that's an adequate response and not too much.
Yeah. One of the things you talk about is because this system was not just legally enforced segregation, because it was a series of quotidian and everyday things that had little informal social rules and that sort of thing.
Right.
It died, but it died slowly in some ways. I wonder if you could tell me in your observations how the change took place after the end of formal legalized segregation. I mean, you talk at one point about how even years after the Civil Rights Act, you still had this kind of hesitation about would the consequences of crossing some certain boundary be.
Right. Well, yeah, I mean, that's true. I think I mentioned this in the book, but one of the funniest instances of like instantaneous change was my great uncle was a mortician in a little town in southeast Arkansas called Eudora, and his name was Clarence Bethune. And the day after Lyndon Johnson signed the 1964 Civil Rights Act, the white barber in town walked down to his funeral home parlor and said to him very politely, so Mr. Bethune, now that the law has changed, I really appreciate your business. I mean, that's one illustration. I mean, those kind of rare, but like de facto versions of the same shift in attitude or behavior were less rare. And as Lyndon Johnson said, I mean, when one of the complaints that opponents of the bill made to Johnson was that you can't legislate what's in people's hearts. And Johnson's response was, well, I'm not concerned about what's in their hearts. I'm concerned about their public behavior. And the fact of the matter is that when patterns of public behavior change, then attitudes change. And just over time or at different paces and in complex ways. I mean, and some of it has to do with familiarity and a shared reservoir of experience, right? So in the late 1980s, I was waiting for a friend to pick me up at the Columbia, South Carolina airport. And I'm standing outside on a pretty day. And I saw these two cops, both about the same age, one black, one white. It was clear that they hadn't really known each other, but they were just out there doing duty, doing cop duty. And they started to engage in banter. And either they both had been high school athletes or had followed high school sports closely then. And their banter led them to bond around, who so thought was like the best halfback or whatever. And I thought about this, and I'd never want to make too much of it. But this says something about one of the things that Jim Crow did and was maybe kind of intended to do, is that when I was coming along, there was no real room for us to have that reservoir of shared experience, even to have banter about. The schools were segregated, the athletic leagues were segregated. You had to pay attention closely, right, to find out who the black star was and who the white star was, right? But there's a lot of other stuff like that. I mean, I mentioned this in the book too, that often when I'm out, like in different places in the South, and see groups of coworkers or neighborhood friends or whatever the hell they are out at a Chili's, right, or TGI Fridays or whatever, having drinks and a meal convivially, that doesn't say anything major about, who's inclined to vote for socialism. But what it does say, or what it does point out, is that that's a level of common experience and a conviviality that wouldn't have been possible before 1968. Now, that said, like the other part of your question about how it began to fade away and the complicated roots. I mean, I also write in a book about being at the El Dorado, Arkansas airport a year after the Civil Rights Act was passed. And I got off the plane. I didn't really understand I had to change planes. I thought it was just a stop. I got deposited the tarmac with my suitcase, and I see there are two entrances to the small airport. Since it was after the act had been passed, the signs marking the different entrances racially had been taken down. I also was pretty sure my parents didn't know I had to change planes either. And it was a Sunday, as I recall. And there was no sign of life in the airport. And I wasn't confident enough that a year after the Civil Rights Act, especially in a backwater like El Dorado, Arkansas, that I could walk into the wrong door with impunity, right? Mm-hmm. And that's partly because I was young enough, I could be mistaken for a civil rights worker. But like things like that happened slowly over time. A guy pulled a gun, or a gas station attendant pulled a gun on me when I stopped to get gas on Interstate 85 in Spartanburg, South Carolina in 1978, because he had blown me off, and I just kind of looked quizzically about when he was going to wait on me to put gas in my car. He was talking to a couple of teenagers. So, yeah, there was a level of uncertainty of that sort, right? And the order drifted away or melted away at different paces and different times and different individuals. But as I also point out in the book, it's easy to mistake what seems familiar for what's actual, right? Mm-hmm. So like I mentioned, that sometimes when I'm sitting on a business class car on Amtrak, I get a little shudder when I think about Homer Plessy and consider that the conductor could come and instruct me to give up my seat to a white person. Well, that's not going to happen. But habituation, right? You can leave. Well, yeah, it's like the equivalent of I'm a scar tissue. So it's easy for us who are on the receiving end of it to sort of lean into, a nothing has changed impression, unnecessary or unjustifiable. Mm-hmm. I don't know if that's adequate either as a response.
Yeah, I did want to ask you. So I want to just read a little passage that captures, I think, one of the core points of your book, which is that we need to appreciate how remarkable the accomplishment of destroying this hideous apartheid regime was. But we also need to understand what was left intact. Right. And you say, the core of the Jim Crow order was a class system rooted in employment and production relations that was imposed, stabilized, regulated, and naturalized through a regime of white supremacist law, practice, custom, rhetoric, and ideology. Defeating the white supremacist regime was a tremendous victory for social justice and egalitarian interests. At the same time, that victory left the undergirding class system untouched and, in practical terms, affirmed it.
Right.
That's the source of that bizarre sensation I felt in the region a generation after the defeat of Jim Crow. And you then comment that a simple racism, anti-racism framework isn't adequate for making sense of the segregation era or up to the task of challenging the inequality and injustice that persists. Perhaps you could elaborate on what you mean by that.
Well, sure. I mean, yeah, I just wrote something else. But I've got a chapter of a book that I'm doing with my friend Kenneth Warren. A chapter I call The Farce This Time, which comes down to an argument or a comparison. Well, an argument, frankly, that the reasons that a simple white supremacy or racism, anti-racism framework appeal to neoliberal anti-racists today of whatever color. Basically the same reasons that they appeal to the planter class at the end of the 19th century, right? Because by reducing all questions of justice and equality to race or racism, right? What you do is you deflect attention away from political economy. So one thing I do in the article or chapter, for instance, is I look at patterns of employment and the racial disparity in two of our more important industries here, right? The hotel industry and the food industry. And in each case, what you find is that the patterns of acute racial disparity exist, the best paid jobs, right? And at the managerial level. It's probably more sharply true in the food service industry than it is in the hotel industry. But for the 70 to 80% of jobs, or 90% of jobs in each industry that are not highly compensated, the racial patterns of occupation are just random. And the problem there is not so much that the best or the most highly paid jobs in the restaurant industry, say, are 3-to-1, if not more, held by whites, because that's a small number in the first place. But the greater problem of equality for blacks as well as for everybody else is that the 80 to 90% of workers in that industry who can't really be statistically distinguished by race, right, on the basis of occupation and income, are jobs that don't pay enough to live on. Right? Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Well, what the racial focus tells us that we should concentrate on the 5 or 10% of jobs in the food service industry in which blacks are highly underrepresented, statistically. But that's a very small number of jobs. And conversely, if you look at a notion of, well, if you have a standard of equality or social justice that isn't restricted to racial disparity, then you realize that you can do a lot more for more black people by unionization, living wage, universal health care, et cetera, et cetera. And that's one of the ways in which I think that continuing or pushing the Jim Crow metaphor forward in time, not only does it disservice, but more and more I think it does the devil's work.
Just to conclude here, we're speaking on Martin Luther King Day, and I was just reading his final book, Where Do We Go From Here? And I just wrote an article about it for Current Affairs. And
good. I look forward to reading that.
It struck me that a lot of the things that he said in the last year or so of his life have something in common with some of the points that you make. Certainly, nobody could doubt his hatred of or commitment to ending Jim Crow,
right.
But he had also pivoted to an internationalism, an anti-imperialism, an anti-poverty, a broadly socialist agenda, which he saw as indispensable. He has in that book a critique of the Black Power slogan, which he saw as ultimately kind of futile and self-defeating. So I wondered if maybe on this Martin Luther King Day, you could tell us what you think the correct lessons to take from him in particular might be.
Right. Well, so that's really interesting, Nathan. I mean, I'm tempted. My fundamental position is that I think, and like this is, well, I mean, no disrespect to the question because it's a natural one, but I think that one of our problems is the extent to which people want to go to history to look for lessons, right?
Right. Okay. Yeah. I can accept that.
But I mean, that said, though, and if you can suffer another plug, like the new issue of Nonsite just came out, and we have a special section on Bayard Rustin and a wonderful essay by Preston Smith that, as I didn't think to say in my discussion of his article, reads all of the substantive history in that Peniel Joseph's book on Black Power left out in his leap from 1972 to hip hop, right? So Preston Smith article is a nice examination, very nice examination of the emergence of the new Black political class, urban politics, post-war, right? Not just after the Voting Rights Act. And it's an examination partly focused here and in Philly on the emergence of a new Black political class, hand in glove with the new developmental or pro-developmental stratum in the post-war decades around the alliance of overturning sort of white ethnic, political machines that weren't responsive enough to either of the two. But anyway, I think in general, the best way for us to approach history, which nobody does anymore, to be honest, but is to approach the past with an eye on trying to understand how dynamics that were at play then, and that means complex ones, contradictions, right? Concatenations like forces, and the trajectories that those contradictions and struggles produced have helped to generate the reality that we live now. And that will also help us understand where our political reality comes from. And I think one of my concerns about the tendency to look to history for lessons is that really what people do is they look to plant ventriloquist dummies in the past. So like a number of the sort of Black conscious films, it's not just the Black consciousness stuff. I remember I watched Ken Follett's Pillars of the Earth as a series on network. And I was struck that what this account did was sort of read the sensibility of contemporary neoliberalism, right, and back into the Middle Ages. And that's what these Black films do too. Yeah, so there is a tendency to want to turn the past either into a source of fortune cookies, right, because that's what timeless wisdom is, right, or into a ventriloquist dummy, the ultimate punchline of which is to tell us that things have always been just as they are now. And I think that's a reactionary imperative.
Well, that's fair enough. I mean, I can accept that. But I will say, going back and reading, where do we go from here? I did think that there's a pretty sensible agenda in there. And I feel like, if people are going to admire Martin Luther King, going back and reading those words as he starts to develop this kind of, move to this socialist phase of his political thinking can be useful and inspiring.
Oh, no, absolutely. And all that said, from my blather up from before, I've written about Rustin and the Freedom Budget, and more to the point, that history of a Black Popular Front leftism from the mid-30s to the 70s or the end of the 60s that was anchored to two principles. One is pursuit of racial equality, and the other is an understanding that the only way to advance and to sustain gains that Black people make is through expanding social state, public sector, and industrial unionism, right? So that the two are combined. And yes, frankly, I often propose that as an alternative way of thinking about the past. So I didn't mean to disparage the question at all, but I was really using your question to beat up on somebody else.
No, that's a fair caution too. I certainly agree with that. And the worst thing you could possibly do, again, just to tie it to the particular holiday on which we record, is the worst. I was just looking at the pictures I haven't been to the Martin Luther King Memorial, but it looks terrible, right? It's just him looking angry in white stone. Like he's just made of stone.
Oh my God. Yeah, I haven't seen it.
Yeah, look up the Martin Luther King Memorial in Washington. It was controversial because it's so obviously terrible.
Yeah.
And it doesn't show like him with people or in a group. It's just him with arms folded.
Well, there you go. Yeah, I mean, that's the new model, right? I mean, well, it's a study of a political process and insurgency in the civil rights movement by Doug McAdam that came out in the early 80s. In the early 80s, there's a photo, the cover photo is of a mass demonstration. The new edition has, I think this is the photo, has like that staged photograph of Rosa Parks sitting, looking, I mean, dignified on the bus with a white guy who it turns out was the New York Times, the photographer, I think, right, and sitting behind her. But like, that's what's happened, right?
Yeah, that's right. I just looked those up. Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, right. The social movement aspect has been dissolved totally. And history then becomes an account of great, larger-than-life individuals. Like in Ava DuVernay's film on Selma, like she said that she didn't want to make it King idolatry, but the fact of the film is King shows up and he radiates a beatific force that galvanizes people to stand up, and the regime falls.
Mm-hmm.
And see, I think that's counterproductive, right? And that's what so many young people think politics is now too, or movement politics or insurgent politics.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, it's always unfortunate that there is, Martin Luther King Day.
Oh yeah, right.
is part of this whole thing. Anyway, The South Jim Crow and Its Afterlives is a very rich book. It is probably the most, quote, accessible of your books, as you've said. I mean, I really think it would be the first thing that I would give someone to introduce someone to your work. It's not academic. I mean, it concerns things that are very serious, but it's kind of fun in parts.
Yeah, I'm glad you like that, too. Yeah, I hope.
Yeah, it's a real triumph. It's a beautiful... I wouldn't usually describe your work as beautiful, but it is. It's moving. It's a lovely book. So congratulations on it, and we hope everyone picks up a copy.
Well, hey, Nathan, thanks again for the compliments. Thanks for having me. I'm really glad you liked the book, and I look forward to doing it again sometime.
Yeah, always good to talk. Thanks so much.
Take care.
The Current Affairs Podcast is a product of Current Affairs Magazine. If you are not subscribed to Current Affairs Magazine, visit currentaffairs.org/subscribe today and get our glorious print edition. The Current Affairs Podcast is released regularly every week on patreon.com/currentaffairs. Thanks for listening.